There is a specific kind of harm that leaves no marks, no raised voices, no slammed doors, no moment you can point to and say, there, that's where it happened. This is Elena Wheeler's account of 3 years inside a marriage that looked, from every angle, like a good one. A story about a birthday dinner that was also something else entirely, about the language of love and the language of control, and how fluently they can sound like the same thing. She tells it herself, in her own words, in the order she was finally able to understand it. Listen carefully. The coffee cups gave it away, though I didn't see it then. Every morning, Mark would place his cup exactly in the center of the saucer. Not approximately, exactly. The handle at a precise 90-degree angle, like a compass needle pointing somewhere only he could read. My cup always had lipstick on the rim by 7:30. His always looked like it came out of a catalog shoot. We've been doing this for 3 years, and somewhere in year 2, I stopped finding it charming and started finding it informative. We lived in Portland, in a house Mark had essentially designed from the inside out. Not architected, curated. Every shelf had intention. The throw blankets were folded in thirds. The books were organized not alphabetically and not by color, which would have been forgivable, but by what Mark called emotional register. I'm a book editor. I had opinions about this. I kept them mostly to myself. He was good at what he did, genuinely, undeniably good. His clients loved him. His colleagues respected him. At dinner parties, he was the person who asked the best follow-up questions and remembered, 6 months later, what you'd said. He read Gottman. He listened to Esther Perel on long drives. He suggested we do weekly check-ins, which we did, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings while he took actual notes in a Moleskine. I'm not making that up. My friend Camille asked me once, around that time, what we were working on. We'd been talking about the check-ins, about the therapy we'd started doing separately and then briefly together. She asked it genuinely. Camille doesn't do loaded questions. I opened my mouth and then closed it. Communication, I finally said. She nodded like that made sense. It didn't really. We communicated constantly. Mark had a vocabulary for our relationship that I sometimes felt I was still learning. He could locate and label emotional states the way a sommelier identifies wine. He'd say things like, I notice you're withdrawing, or I think there's some avoidance happening here. And the terrible thing was, he was usually right, which made it very hard to argue that something was wrong. I'd been in therapy since I was 24. I knew the language too. But there's a difference between using that language to understand yourself and using it to narrate someone else. I was starting to learn that difference. Slowly. The October before my birthday, I remember sitting in the bathtub after one of our check-ins and thinking, I am so tired. Not of him specifically, of the effort of existing inside the structure he built around us and calling it a home. He was never cruel. That's the thing I'd come back to over and over in the months that followed. He never raised his voice, never dismissed me, never forgot an anniversary. He sent me lunch on office days, always exactly what I'd been planning to order because he remembered my schedule better than I did. Once I mentioned that to my therapist, almost as a compliment. She said, how did it make you feel? I said I didn't know. I still don't have a clean answer for that. The week before my birthday, he told me he'd planned something special. A dinner. A real one, not our usual neighborhood places. He said it with that particular energy he had when he was proud of himself. Warm, a little contained, like someone holding a good hand. I felt a small tug of unease that I immediately talked myself out of. That's the version of me I have the hardest time with, looking back. Not the one who sat through the dinner, or the one who cried in the car on the way home from coffee with Sophia 3 weeks later. The one in the bathtub, in October, who knew something was off and filed it under my own anxiety and went to bed. She was trying her best. I understand that now. She was also wrong. The restaurant was called Loose. Mark had made the reservation 2 weeks in advance. I found that out later, which meant he'd been planning this since before he told me anything, which meant there was a version of events where he considered telling me earlier and decided against it. I've thought about that a lot. The decision not to warn me. Whether it was strategic or whether he genuinely believed that surprise was a form of generosity. Loose was Italian, candlelit, the kind of place where the acoustics are soft enough that difficult conversations stay at the table. I noticed that too later. At the time, I just thought it was pretty. She was already seated when we arrived. I saw her before Mark said anything. A woman at a corner table, dark hair, good posture, the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and decided to make waiting look intentional. She looked up when we walked in, and something moved across her face that I couldn't name then. I can name it now. It was assessment. Mark put his hand on the small of my back and said, "Lena, this is Sophia. She's one of the most important people in my life, and I wanted the people who matter to me to know each other." 3 seconds of silence. I have replayed those 3 seconds more times than I can count. What I felt was not jealousy, or not only jealousy. It was something more disorienting than that. It was the feeling of walking into a room and realizing the furniture has been rearranged while you were sleeping. Everything technically in its place. The geometry subtly wrong. Sophia stood and extended her hand. Her grip was firm and brief, professional almost. She said, "Mark has told me so much about you," and smiled in a way that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to be genuine, measured enough to signal that she was not unaware of the strangeness of the situation. I shook her hand. I sat down. I picked up the menu. I want to be honest about what happened next. I performed. I performed well. I asked Sophia about her work. Corporate communications consulting, based in Seattle, recently relocated to Portland for a project. I laughed at the right moments. I let Mark pour my wine. I was, by any external measure, gracious. And the whole time, some part of me was very quietly taking notes. Sophia was not what I'd expected, which meant I had expected something, which meant I had already constructed a version of her before she existed in the room. The ex-girlfriend is category. She didn't fit it. She was composed without being cold. She spoke about her work with genuine precision. When Mark told a story from their past, carefully, nothing intimate, a road trip story involving a broken-down car in Nevada, she let him tell it without jumping in to correct details, which is actually harder than it sounds when someone is telling a story you were present for. But there were moments. Mark kept saying Sophie and I, abbreviated, easy, the kind of shorthand that accumulates between people over years. Every time he said it, I felt it like a small adjustment in air pressure. Not painful, just present. At one point, he looked at me with this expression I recognized, the one that meant he believed something good was happening, and said, "Isn't this great? I just think there's something so, I don't know, so write about the people you love being able to just exist together." The word just. As if it were simple. As if I had been given a gift and the correct response was gratitude. Sophia was quiet for a moment after he said that. She looked at her wine glass. It was brief enough that Mark didn't notice. I noticed. He went to pay the check, and we were alone for maybe 30 seconds. I was looking at the candle. Sophia said, quietly, without drama, "You're handling this better than I would have." I looked at her. I didn't know what to say. I still don't know what she meant, whether it was solidarity, or an apology, or something else entirely. What I know is that it was the only moment in the entire evening when I felt like someone was speaking to me directly, without a script. In the car on the way home, Mark held my hand over the gear shift and said, "I'm so glad you two met," with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully completed a project. I said, "Thank you for dinner." He didn't hear what I actually said. That was, by then, a pattern I recognized. I stared out the window at the wet Portland streets and thought about the way Sophia had looked at her wine glass when Mark said the word just. I thought, she knows something. I thought, I need to find out what. I didn't cry that night. I want to note that, because I think people expect a certain kind of story, the wronged wife, the dramatic confrontation, the tears in the bathroom while the husband sleeps. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, harder to explain. I lay next to Mark in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about sentence structure. That's the occupational hazard of being an editor. Everything becomes text eventually. I was trying to locate the argument, find the through line. Because here was the problem. If I said, "What you did was wrong," Mark would ask me to be specific. He would listen carefully and reflect back what he heard, and then gently, thoroughly, dismantle my specifics one by one using the language of emotional intelligence. I had watched him do this before. With me, with colleagues, once with a contractor who tried to overcharge him. He was gifted at it. The conversation would end with me feeling like the problem was my perception and not his action. I needed to understand what had actually happened before I said a word. So I didn't say anything. Not that night, not the next morning. Mark made eggs and talked about a project deadline and asked if I liked Sophia. I said she seemed interesting. He looked pleased. I drank my coffee and watched him and thought, I am reading you right now. I am reading you like a manuscript. The next 3 days I moved through our house like an anthropologist. I started noticing things I'd registered before but never assembled into a pattern. The way Mark framed disagreements, always in terms of my emotional state, rarely in terms of his actions. I notice you're frustrated rather than, I understand why what I did was frustrating. The difference sounds small. It isn't. One locates the problem inside me. The other acknowledges that he might be the source. I thought about the therapist thing, how he'd told my individual therapist, Dr. Okafor, the details of a fight we'd had, framing it as context. Dr. Okafor had mentioned it in passing, clearly assuming I'd known. I hadn't. When I brought it up to Mark, he'd explained it so reasonably. I just wanted her to have the full picture. I care about your process. That I'd ended up thanking him. I had actually thanked him. I thought about the dinner parties where Mark would tell stories about my childhood, drawn from things I'd shared in private. Not malicious stories. Warm, humanizing ones. Stories that made people like me. I had never told him he could do that. He had never asked. I thought about the books organized by emotional register. On the third day, I opened Instagram on my phone and found Sophia Reyes without much effort. Her profile was mostly professional, conference panels, articles she'd written, occasional landscape photography. She looked, in her photos, like a person who had decided exactly how much of herself to make visible and was comfortable with that decision. I typed, "It was nice to meet you." Then I sat there for a long time with my thumb over the send button. What I was actually asking underneath those 5 words was, what did you mean in that restaurant? What do you know? And why did you come? I sent it. She replied in 4 hours. You too. I hope the rest of your birthday was good. I stared at that. The acknowledgement that she knew it had been my birthday. Something about seeing it written down. The confirmation that she had walked into that restaurant knowing it was my birthday and sat down anyway made something shift in my chest. Not anger. Closer to clarity. I wrote back, "Would you want to get coffee sometime?" She replied, "Yes. I was wondering if you'd ask." That line kept me up that night. Not Mark's breathing, not the architecture of our argument. That line, "I was wondering if you'd ask." It implied she'd been waiting. It implied she had her own questions. It implied that what happened at Luce was not, from her perspective, finished. Mark, during all of this, was in a good mood. Attentive, affectionate, proud of himself in that low-key way he had. He mentioned Sophia twice, once to suggest we all have dinner again soon, once to say he thought we'd really connect, given our similar sensibilities. Each time I said something non-committal and watched him accept it as agreement. I was learning, very late, how to hold information without showing it. It felt terrible. It also felt necessary. And underneath both of those feelings was something I didn't have a name for yet. A kind of grief, not for what had happened, but for how long it had been happening without my full awareness. For the woman in the bathtub in October who filed her own unease under anxiety and went to bed. I made the appointment with Sophia for the following Thursday. I didn't tell Mark. The coffee shop was Sophia's suggestion, a place in the Pearl District called Coava, high ceilings, communal tables, the kind of ambient noise that makes private conversations feel safer. I got there first and took a small table near the window. I ordered a cordidu and sat with my hands around the cup and tried to decide what I was actually doing there. I was there to understand something. That much I knew. I wasn't there to make a friend, or to build a case, or to perform the role of wronged wife for an audience of one. I was there because Sophia Reyes had walked into that restaurant on my birthday knowing it was my birthday, and had looked at her wine glass when Mark said the word just, and had told me I was handling it better than she would have. And those 3 things together formed a sentence I couldn't finish on my own. I walked in 4 minutes after the hour. Not late, not aggressively early. She ordered a black coffee, sat down, and looked at me with that same measuring quality I'd noticed at Luce, but warmer now, without the performance of a first meeting. She said, "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." I said, "I wasn't sure either." That was the most honest thing I'd said out loud in about 2 weeks. We started carefully. She asked about my work, genuinely, it seemed, not as a preamble. I told her about the manuscript I was editing, a debut novel, a young woman's voice I found completely alive on the page. Sophia listened in a way that reminded me of Mark, actually, that focused, retentive attention, but without the Moleskine, without the note-taking quality. She was just listening. I asked about her work. She described a corporate restructuring project, the particular challenge of helping organizations communicate change without inducing panic. She was precise about it. She used the word architecture twice, which I noted without mentioning. We talked around the subject for maybe 20 minutes. It felt like two people walking the perimeter of a building before deciding whether to go inside. Then I said, "Can I ask you something directly?" She said, "Please." "Did you know it was my birthday?" A beat. "Yes." "Did you think about not coming?" She looked at her coffee. I thought about it for about 2 days. Then I decided that not coming wouldn't change anything about the situation, and at least if I came I could. She stopped. Started again. I thought I could make it easier. "I'm not sure I did." "Why did he ask you?" I said. What reason did he give you?" And that's when Sophia told me. She told me carefully, without editorializing, in the same precise way she described her work. She told me that Mark had reached out to her about 6 weeks before my birthday. That he'd said he'd been thinking about integration. The word he used was integration, of the important relationships in his life. That he believed the people who had shaped him should know the people he loved now. That he'd framed it, she said, as a kind of emotional project he was working on. She told me this was not the first time he'd done something like this. When they were together, 4 years, ending about 18 months before I met Mark, he had wanted her to meet a woman named Patricia, a high school teacher who had, according to Mark, fundamentally shaped his understanding of intellectual rigor. He'd arranged a dinner. Sophia had gone. Patricia had been perfectly nice and completely bewildered. After that, there had been a college roommate, then an ex-girlfriend from his junior year abroad. "He introduced you to his ex?" I said. "He introduced me to his ex," Sophia confirmed. He explained that she represented an important period of emotional growth. I sat with that for a moment. "What did you do?" I asked. "I went," she said. Because he explained it so reasonably that saying no felt like I was being rigid, like I was the one with the problem. There it was. That sentence. I felt it land somewhere specific in my chest. "When did you end it?" I asked. "With him." She looked out the window. A cyclist passed in the rain. About 8 months after the ex-girlfriend dinner. It wasn't one thing. It was... She paused, choosing words the way I chose words at work, carefully, for accuracy. I told him I felt like a character in a story he was writing, that I didn't feel seen as a person so much as cast in a role. He said I was being closed off, that I was projecting. "He told me that too," I said. "The closed off thing." She looked at me. "I know." He mentioned it. The fact that he had discussed my emotional patterns with his ex-girlfriend, clinically, therapeutically, as data, should have made me angrier than it did. Instead, I felt something almost like relief. The relief of a diagnosis after a long illness. The relief of, it's real. I didn't imagine it. We sat quietly for a moment. "Do you think he knows?" I asked. "What he's doing?" Sophia turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I've thought about that for a long time," she said. "I think he believes he's loving people well. I think the architecture of it, the control, the narrating, I think that part is invisible to him, which is either very sad or very frightening depending on the day." I nodded. We stayed another 30 minutes, talking about smaller things. Not friends exactly. We both understood that this was not the beginning of a friendship so much as the completion of a necessary exchange. We had given each other something specific. We didn't need to build on it. Outside on the sidewalk, she pulled her coat closed against the cold and said, "Take care of yourself, Elena. Not good luck. Not let me know how it goes. Take care of yourself," which implied she understood that some care was required, and that the person responsible for providing it was me. I walked to my car and sat in it for a long time without starting the engine. I knew what I was going to do. I think I'd known since the bathtub in October, and before that probably. In all those small moments I'd filed under my own anxiety and declined to examine. The coffee with Sophia hadn't told me what to do. It had just confirmed that what I already knew was, in fact, real. I drove home. Mark's car was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. I sat outside for 4 minutes. Then I went in. He was making dinner when I walked in. salmon, roasted vegetables, a bottle of Willamette Valley Pinot open on the counter. Soft music, the kind he put on when he wanted the house to feel like a considered choice rather than just a place where two people lived. He turned when he heard the door and smiled, and the smile was genuine, and that genuineness was, as always, the hardest part. "Hey," he said. "Perfect timing, 20 minutes." I put my bag down. I took off my coat. I hung it on the hook by the door. His system, hooks assigned by person, labeled with small brass letters he'd ordered from a design shop in Brooklyn. My hook was E, his was M. I had thought it was charming once. "Where were you?" he asked, turning back to the stove. "Coffee with a friend," I said. Technically true. I sat at the kitchen island and watched him cook, and thought about how good he was at this. The meal, the music, the wine already open and breathing. He was a man who understood that environments communicate. He had built this one carefully. It said, "We are people who eat well and talk openly and have a beautiful life." It said it fluently. Over dinner, he talked about a project, a residential commission in Lake Oswego, a client who kept changing the brief. He was funny about it, self-deprecating in the way he could be when he felt secure. I ate and listened and responded at the right intervals and thought about what Sophia had said. The architecture of it is invisible to him. After dinner, after he'd cleared the plates in the specific order he always cleared them, he poured the last of the wine and looked at me across the table with that particular focused attention. The check-in look, I called it privately, and said, "You seem quiet tonight, what's going on?" And there it was, the opening move, framed as care. I put down my glass. I had rehearsed this, in the car, in the 4 minutes in the driveway. I had decided not to come in hot, not to make it a confrontation, not to give him a terrain he knew how to navigate. I was going to be specific, concrete. I was going to say exactly what happened and exactly what I felt about it. And I was not going to let the conversation become about my perception. "Mark," I said, "I want to talk about my birthday dinner." He nodded, settled back slightly, prepared to listen, which with Mark meant prepared to process and respond and ultimately reframe. "You arranged for me to meet your ex-girlfriend on my birthday," I said, "without asking me, without telling me who she was until we were already there. I wanted it to be a surprise." "I know," I said. "That's part of what I'm telling you." He was quiet for a moment. I watched him locate his register, the careful, therapeutic one. "I hear that the surprise element felt like a lack of consideration," he said. "And I understand why you'd experience it that way. That wasn't my intention, and I'm sorry the execution landed that way." The execution landed that way. Passive construction. The dinner had landed. Not, "I made a decision that affected you without your input." The subject of the sentence was the event, not him. "It's not about the surprise," I said. "It's about the decision itself. You decided, without asking me, that your ex-girlfriend should be a significant person in my life. You decided that on my birthday. And when I think about it, when I actually think about it, I realize this is something you do. You decide things about my life, and then you present them to me in a way that makes it very hard to object without seeming unreasonable." Something moved across his face. Not anger. Mark rarely did anger in the conventional sense. It was more like a recalibration, like a GPS rerouting. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're describing something much more systemic than one dinner. And I want to engage with that. I really do. But I also want to gently name that when we're in conflict, you sometimes have a tendency to catastrophize, to take one event and build a larger narrative around it. And I wonder if some of what you're feeling tonight is connected to other things. Stress at work, the fact that birthdays can bring up a lot." "Mark," he stopped. "I had coffee with Sophia today," I said. The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the conversation. It had a different texture. I watched him process this, the fact of it, the implications of it, the thing it meant that I had gone without telling him and was telling him now, at this moment, in this context. "Okay," he said, slowly. What did you two talk about?" "About you," I said. "About patterns." "I see." A pause. "And you feel like what she told you is..." "Elena, Sophia and I ended on difficult terms. She has her own perspective on our relationship, and I think it's worth considering that perspective with some..." "She told me about Patricia," I said, "and the college roommate, and the ex-girlfriend from your junior year abroad." Silence. "She told me that when she said she felt like a character in your story, you told her she was being closed off," I said. "You told me the same thing. Last spring when I said I felt like you didn't always see me clearly. Closed off. Same phrase." He looked at his wine glass. For the first time in the conversation, he didn't have an immediate response assembled. I watched him search for one, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, sadness. Real sadness, for both of us, for the amount of time we had spent in this house being fluent in each other and still somehow completely lost. "I love you," he said finally. And he meant it. I could hear that he meant it, which was maybe the most painful thing he'd said all evening. "I know," I said. "I love you too." "Then can we work on this? I can call Dr. Okafor. We can go back to couples therapy. I will do whatever." "Mark," I said quietly, "I need you to actually hear what I'm saying. Not process it, not locate it in a framework, just hear it." He looked at me. "I have been a character in your story," I said, "for 3 years. And I don't think you meant to do that. I don't think you're a bad person. But I've been trying to figure out for months why I'm so tired in my own home, and I finally understand what I'm tired of. I'm tired of being narrated." The kitchen was very quiet. The music had stopped at some point, without either of us noticing. Mark opened his mouth, then he closed it. Then he said very carefully, "I think I need some time to sit with what you're saying." Which was the right thing to say, which was the thing a person says when they've been told something true and need to process it honestly. And I sat there and looked at this man, this careful, intelligent, genuinely well-intentioned man, and understood with complete clarity that the right thing to say and the ability to change were not the same thing. I nodded. I washed my dish and put it in the drying rack and went to bed. I lay in the dark and listened to him sit alone in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't sleep much, but for the first time in months, the wakefulness felt like mine. I didn't leave dramatically. That's the thing nobody tells you about the endings that actually stick. They don't look like endings while they're happening. There's no single moment where the music swells and you walk out with your jaw set and your eyes clear. There's just a series of ordinary mornings that gradually become unbearable, and then one morning that is somehow different from the others, and then you go. It took me 3 weeks after that kitchen conversation. Mark did call Dr. Okafor. He made the appointment the very next day, which was exactly the kind of swift, demonstrable action he was good at, the kind that looks like change and functions as argument. "See? I'm doing the thing. I heard you. I'm doing the thing." We went twice together. Mark was excellent in therapy. He was articulate, self-aware, willing to examine himself in the room. Dr. Okafor said he was making real progress. I sat across from him in that office and watched him be excellent, and felt myself disappearing, incrementally, like a document being edited down to nothing. The second session, he said something that I've thought about every day since. He said, "I think I've been so focused on building something beautiful that I forgot to ask Elena if this was the house she wanted to live in." It was a perfect sentence. Genuinely, structurally perfect. The architectural metaphor, the acknowledgement, the implicit apology. Dr. Okafor looked moved. I looked at my hands. I thought, he will be saying that sentence for years. At dinner parties, to the next therapist, to the next woman. Not because he didn't mean it, because he did mean it, completely, in the moment he said it. And meaning something completely in the moment is not the same as understanding it in your bones, in the place where behavior actually changes. I am not saying he was irredeemable. I want to be clear about that. I am saying that I was 31 years old, and I was tired, and I did not have another 3 years to wait and find out. I started making practical decisions quietly, the way I'd learned to hold information without showing it. I called my friend Camille and told her what was happening. The real version, not the "we're working on some things" version. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. And when I finished, she said, "Where are you going to go?" Not, "Are you sure?" or "Have you tried?" Just, "Where are you going?" I loved her for that. She had a spare room. She'd had it for 2 years since her roommate moved to Chicago. She told me it was mine for as long as I needed it. I found an apartment 3 weeks later. A 1-bedroom in Northeast Portland, 2nd floor, with windows that faced east and got good morning light. The bedroom was small. The kitchen had exactly enough counter space for one person's coffee setup. I stood in it for about 4 minutes and felt something unlock in my ribcage. I signed the lease on a Tuesday. I told Mark on a Thursday. I had written down what I wanted to say, not because I needed a script, but because I knew that without one, I would let him talk me into a framework, and I would end up comforting him, and I would leave that conversation having agreed to another appointment with Dr. Okafor. I had 3 sentences. I read them to myself in the parking garage of my office building before I drove home. He was in his office when I got there, the small room off the hallway where he kept his drafting table and his architectural models. Little white and balsa constructions of buildings that hadn't been built yet. I stood in the doorway and he turned around and looked at me, and I think he knew before I said anything. He had good instincts. That was always true. "I'm leaving," I said. "I've signed a lease on an apartment. I'm going to start moving things this weekend. I think we should talk to a lawyer about next steps. And I want to do this as cleanly as possible because I don't want to fight with you." He stared at me. "Elena, I need you to let me finish," I said. "I've thought about this for a long time. This isn't a reaction to one thing. This is me understanding something about myself that I should have understood sooner and acting on it. I don't want to have the conversation about whether this is the right decision, because I've already had that conversation with myself, and I know the answer." His eyes were bright. Mark didn't cry often. He processed, he reflected, he named his emotions with precision, but his eyes were bright, and his jaw was tight, and he looked, for maybe the first time since I'd known him, like someone who had no language for what he was feeling. He said, "I don't understand," and I believed him. I believed that he genuinely, truly did not understand. Not as deflection, not as manipulation, but as plain fact. He had done his work, said his sentences, made his appointments. He had built the house carefully. He could not understand why I wouldn't live in it. "I know," I said. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved the truth even now, that's why. I left him in his office with his unbuilt building. Moving out took 2 weekends. Mark was not there for either of them. He stayed at his colleague David's place, which I appreciated. Camille helped me both times, driving her Subaru back and forth while I carried boxes and tried not to editorialize about what to keep. I kept my books. I left the throw blankets, folded in thirds. I did not talk to Sophia again after Coava. We followed each other on Instagram for a few months. I'd see her conference panels, her landscape photographs, and then one day I noticed she'd moved back to Seattle, and sometime after that I unfollowed her without much deliberation. We had given each other what we needed to give. That was its own kind of completeness. I thought about her sometimes, though. Not obsessively, just occasionally, the way you think about someone who handed you something important without making a production of it. I hope she was okay. I think she was. My east-facing apartment got light by 7:15. I bought a coffee maker. A simple one, no precision settings, no ritual. And in the mornings, I'd make a cup and sit on the floor by the window because I didn't have a chair yet and I didn't rush to get one. I sat on the floor and drank coffee with lipstick on the rim and watched the light come in and thought about nothing in particular. The cup never sat in the center of anything. I want to say that leaving felt like freedom. Immediately. Cleanly. The way it does in the kind of story I used to edit. The protagonist walks out and the world opens up and you understand that she's going to be fine. It wasn't like that. It was strange and sad and quiet, and some mornings I missed him with a specificity that surprised me. Missed the Sunday check-ins, missed the way he remembered things, missed being known, even by someone who knew me wrong. But I also noticed things I hadn't noticed in years. The particular way my mind worked in the morning before anyone else's voice entered it. The books I actually wanted to read, in whatever order I wanted to read them. The sensation of making a small decision, what to have for dinner, which route to walk to work, and having it be entirely, unnarratedly mine. I started writing, a little. Nothing serious, just notes. In a plain black notebook I bought at a drugstore. Trying to get the sequence right. Trying to understand what I'd been inside of, and when exactly it had started, and what I might have seen earlier if I'd known what to look for. I'm still not sure I have the full answer to that. What I have is this. I know that there is a kind of control that never raises its voice, that speaks the language of care and growth and emotional maturity, that builds you a beautiful house and genuinely cannot understand why you won't stay in it. I know that the most disorienting thing about that kind of control is that from the inside it looks, for a long time, like love. It took me 3 years, and 1 birthday dinner, and 1 cup of coffee with a woman I'll probably never see again to understand the difference. I'm a book editor. I work with language for a living. I should have caught it sooner, but I caught it. That's the ending I have. It's not clean, and it's not triumphant, and some mornings it still doesn't feel like enough. Most mornings, though, it does. Okay, that one was heavy. And let's be honest, Mark is a strange, strange man. Technically, Elena had no formal reason to leave. He didn't cheat, didn't lie, didn't disappear. He showed up, did the therapy, said the right things. By every checkbox, he was trying. But that's exactly what makes this story so uncomfortable. Because something was deeply off. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. In that quiet, creeping way that's much harder to name and much harder to escape. The kind of thing that makes you feel crazy for even bringing it up. Mark may have genuinely loved Elena. We'll give him that. But there's a real possibility that beneath all that emotional vocabulary and careful architecture, something in him simply could not see another person as fully, completely separate from his own story. And that, whether it has a clinical name or not, is exhausting to live with. So I'm asking you directly, did Elena make the right call? Or did she walk away from a man who just needed more time? Write your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of story hits different for you, subscribe. There's more where this came from. See you soon.